Halafia, I'm Dr. Gloria L, peace host and producer of OmniU Presents, the H3O Art of Life show. And we have a show entitled Education versus Miseducation. And I have someone here who is quite capable of having that discussion with me. His name is Wayne Sebamurti, Gentry. And I'm happy to invite you back. The last time you were here, you were on with somebody else, but I thought you had enough things of interest to me that we could have a conversation of our own. I just want to open up with the fact that Dr. Carter G. Woodson, who actually was the founder or the originator of the so-called Negro History Week, which is turned into Black History Month, wrote a book called The Miseducation of the Negro, and actually it was a series of lectures that he had given in various places that were compiled and made into a book which became a classic piece of literature and a guide for our people. And in it he talked about not only the process of miseducation of the Negro, but he also talked about the fallout or the inevitable result of a people having been miseducated. And so I thought that we might have a little chat about the miseducation of the Negro as it originated during the period of chattel slavery on the plantation. And what I was thinking about was that in Africa, African children were educated by their community, particularly their mothers and fathers and other family members, by experience. They were taught, the girls were with their mothers and they learned to do the things that their mothers knew how to do. And the boys were with the fathers and they learned to do what the fathers learned to do. But education, when they say it takes a whole village to raise a child, it took a whole village to educate a child. And so every member of an African community, every member of the family was involved in the education of the children. And we had, of course, the griots, who were the people who maintained the records of our history orally and who would come and recite our history so that we would know who we were and from whence we had come. And our names were a part of that process of helping us to know and remember who we were and from whence we had come. And so the African captive slave trade, which I don't really like to use the word slave because I came too late in the game, but the African captive trade, in which Africans were kidnapped from the land and the culture and the kinship groups of which they were a part, and separated and dispersed all over the diaspora, and finally winding up on auction blocks and plantations here on this side of the ocean, disrupted our way of life and left us saddled with a situation in which we were unable to continue the process of educating our young. And that process was not addressed for many years, as you know.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is very serious, and I'd like to first thank you for having me again on your show, Dr. Peace. It's a grand opportunity to be with you because you have a lot of wisdom, and I've watched your program for so many years, and I have learned a lot. And as you mentioned, Dr. Carter G. Woodson, in writing that book, The Miseducation of the Negro, he points out how we are being miseducated because we're not educated into a knowledge of who we are. And education's purpose is to know thyself, to know who you are. And in his travels around the world, he saw how African people, wherever they existed outside of their indigenous culture, was being miseducated. And everything that you do is predicated on what you know. And how knowledge gets established in your mind, that comes through a process of education. So if you are being miseducated, then wrong knowledge is being established in your mind, and that's going to manifest in your actions and what you do.
Wrong actions.
Wrong actions, which means that everything that you're doing in your living is not going to be fulfilling for the purpose and reason why you are here. And this is one of the problems that we are confronted with as African people, being that we have been severely miseducated, that we don't know who we are. We don't even have a clue as to all of the potential that is within us, or how we have been educated when we were in our indigenous culture. We don't have a clue for that. And so that particular book is a book that every African person should read, because it's something that has been our experience, being miseducated, and it has a serious consequence, because when you are being miseducated, and that is principally tied to being enculturated away from your culture, what that does is it creates a misorientation. You suffer from a condition of cultural misorientation. Culture is what gives you the knowledge of who you are, through culture. And people who have been culturally misoriented suffer from a condition that's called self-alienation, which means you're going to operate off a foreign self, and you're going to serve foreigners. And you know that this is the condition of African people who are not re-educating themselves and learning about their true culture and rediscovering who they are as African people, that we are serving foreigners and we're operating off of a foreign self.
Well, you know, I think about having heard the term used, hydroponic Negroes. When it comes to me, I'll be able to tell you who authored that concept. But the hydroponic plants are plants that are grown in water. They're grown without soil, and therefore they're grown without the substance, the elements, the minerals, the nutrients that they would get and incorporate in themselves if they were grown in soil. And so we have the notion of hydroponic Negroes, or black people, who are, as you say, serving a foreign self because they're growing up out of the land, they're outside of their cultural base, and consequently they're not taking root, the kind of roots that they would have taken had they been left intact in the place where they originated. Exactly. And so that's essentially the major part of the problem, and contributing factors to the problem on the plantation during chattel slavery. And I always like to use chattel slavery because I always want to make it clear that slavery continues, that slavery does not have to consist of having chains. Exactly. And slavery is a condition in which you do not know who you are. You cannot make the major decisions that define who you are and affect your life and the lives of others that you love and about whom you care. So during chattel slavery, that was the slavery, the plantation, visible plantation, because we still have plantations. So it's kind of hard to make these distinctions. But during chattel slavery on the plantation, it was forbidden to teach black people to read because it was considered to be dangerous. A black person who could read was considered to be a danger to the status quo. So this was not allowed. What was done eventually, however, was that some modicum of, quote, education was given to the captives or the slaves so that they would be able to perform duties, so that they could carry out the master's or the slave owner's will, not so that they could do for self, not so that they could know thyself, but so that they could know who they were in relationship to the slave owner, and and see as their purpose the service to the slave owner. And in that regard, the scriptures were used, and one of the chief verses was, "Servants, obey your masters," so that African people were redefined as slaves, as servants of slave owners, and they were told what was in the scriptures, and they were given spokespersons, hand-chosen and trained by the master to give them their religious education.
Exactly. That is exactly what happened. And it's really, as we had mentioned before in the prior program, it's really not education, it's a training. Because education is about educing your humanity. That which is within you is what's being brought forth. That's what education, the word education means. So it was a training that we were being involved with for the benefit of those who enslaved us. And religious indoctrination exactly happened the same way. It was for the benefit of those who enslaved us. And the interesting thing about it is that there was a book written in 1842 about a guy, his name was Charles Colcott Jones, a white man. And he wrote this book, and it chronicles the religious instructions of the Negro. In fact, that's the name of the book. From 1619 up until that time. And he talks about how it would benefit. It talks about the religious instruction that the Negroes received all throughout the country, and how these instructions were to help us to be a little bit more human, not necessarily human is equal to a European, but the docileness, the laziness, all of the things that characterizes the stereotypes that we were associated with, how they actually perceived us. This religious instruction was going to help us. But at the same time, it was going to give to us this subordinate way of living and looking at those who are religiously instructing us, a way of relating as them being our masters.
And our superiors.
And then there's, right, our superiors. And so, and just as we would relate to them as being masters in the slave-master relationship, that master also took on the identity of a deity. That in them taking on our religions and being instructed in the way of our religion, that they're going to see us as masters. And what's interesting about that is that there was a program called Slave Narratives, where they had interviewed ex-slaves during the 1920s and 30s. I don't know if you viewed that. It was an HBO special. And they had different people giving narratives of actual accounts of these slaves, of what ex-slaves, of their experiences. And one of the persons who were given an account was recounting when her master had died. And she said, "Our father, our master is gone." And she was referring to him as God, in that sense. These are actual words. And then they were also talking about how the ex-slaves were mentioning how they were actually forced to take these religions, that they weren't religions that they welcomed, that they were in fact beat into them in the same ways that the names were beat into them. And another interesting thing about how education, the way we were miseducated, and the way we were forced to take on this religious orientation that we have, is that when you, just as I've said, when you culturally misoriented, it creates a self-alienation. When you are religiously misoriented, it creates God alienation. And God alienation means that you're going to have a wrong understanding of God, and you're going to serve foreign gods. And this is exactly what is happening with African people, because the religious orientations that we are operating out of, those of us who have taken on their religions, is founded on religious illiteracy, being that the religion itself was never understood. I shouldn't even say religion. The spirituality that was encountered by the early Europeans when they encountered the ancient Egyptian spiritual way of living was never really understood. And what was created out of that misunderstanding was religions. And these different religions over time passed on from first encountering the Greeks, passed on to the Romans, and then Romans passed on to Great Britain, and then the first people to bring the colonies, to create the colonies here in America, coming from Europe. All of this religious illiteracy came down, stepped down to be passed on to us because they were forced onto us when we were brought over here enslaved. So it's not really a proper religious orientation because the illiteracy that is founded on by the people who never really understood it. And so many of us are in religions and think that we have a proper religious orientation, but we have not really inspected that religion. We've just accepted what was given to us by our parents in the form of beliefs in what they understood of it, but it has not really been inspected. We haven't done the research. We haven't done Sankofa, which is an Akan word that means to go back to the essence and find out to the source in order to move forward. We have not done that. We simply take what has been handed to us and believe and move on with that. But it's all founded on illiteracy. Even the education, the way of being educated is wrong. It's founded on illiteracy also, because education is about knowing thyself in a holistic way. It's not about understanding things from an outside in. It's not even about training. It's about tapping into this knowledge that is within you and allowing that knowledge to be your guide. And that knowledge shows itself as intelligence, which solves all of your problems, all the relationship problems that you have, economic, political, all of the problems that exist now. They exist because we are not tapping into the intelligence that is within us to solve all of these problems.
And it's very important that you spend a little time with the intelligence that is within us, because I maintain and have for a long time that what is purported to be intelligence, according to academicians, is not intelligence at all. This whole idea of IQ, I call it, it's not an intelligence quotient, I call it an EQ. It's a European quotient. It shows to the extent to which you have been exposed to European values and ideas. That is what it measures. It measures verbal skills, and verbal skills are not high on in the context of intelligence. Verbal skills are about midway the context of it. There's all kinds of intelligence above the ability to read and to write, and all kinds above the ability to read and write standard English. Because standard English is problematic. But we won't go there. We'll just say that to claim to be measuring IQ, to claim to be able to come up with an intelligence quotient by giving people a culturally biased test based on a language that is foreign, which is based in turn on values that are foreign, and to have people to have to prove that they are intelligent or show some signs of having not being inferior, which is the other side of that, by taking a test designed by someone who had an ulterior motive to prove your inferiority to you, statistically and quantitatively, is to be naive to a fault. So when we're talking about intelligence, we're not talking about the intelligence that is measurable by a pen and pencil test
Right.
based on standard English, based on the culture and experience of Europeans. When you're talking about intelligence, you're talking about natural, innate intelligence, which is every African and every human being's birthright.
Exactly.
So you may have the floor.
Exactly. That's exactly what it is. All of us are naturally intelligent. It is within every human being. And what you are supposed to be doing with your life is tapping into that intelligence. And the way you tap into that intelligence, it begins, of course, with you observing nature, observing yourself, observing the relationship that you have in your life, the relationship that you have with nature. And as you observe, you begin to pay more attention to what is going on inside you and outside of you. And that attention stretches to whereas you have an insight. An insight is nothing more than the perception of a whole, whereas you get the whole picture, the aha, I see it. And that perception of a whole produces a gap where there's a tapping into this intelligence that is already within you that comes forth as a light to show you and bequeath to you the understanding of that which you are in search of. And it's always within you. So it's like an evocation process. Their symbols work best. Metaphors and symbols work best to trigger what is already within you, out of you. And as you said so eloquently, the verbal skills is a very, very low measure of what we call intelligence. Memorization, just being able to recall and bring back what you have remembered in a verbal sense. That's very, 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 very low on the scale of trying to measure intelligence. You can't really measure intelligence, but when you're trying to see what shows itself as a manifest form of intelligence, verbal is very low, because the deepest and highest sense of intelligence that you're going to access, which will help you to solve all of your problems, it happens through silence. It doesn't happen through any type of verbal, word, sound type manifestation. It happens through becoming quiet, becoming silent. And as you do that, that's, in fact, is the key to having insights. It's even been said that Albert Einstein had the insight of the theory of relativity when he was gardening, not when he was at the board trying to really figure out all of the different mathematical equations to solve or try to understand what are the relationships of everything. It came to him when he was very relaxed, and the insight came to him. And that's how we have insight, by being relaxed, by being quiet, by being silent. And this is what one of the benefits of meditation does. It disengages you from the noise that's constantly created by this mind that's always chattering, trying to solve problems, trying to worry about this, trying to preconceive that, making judgments on this, making judgments on that. The mind is always getting in the way of this natural intelligence that exists within us. Intelligence is not a mental thing. It's not something that's created by the mind. The mind, in fact, creates veils that obscures the natural free-flowing of this intelligence. And this is why when you meditate, you enter into a quiet space, inner space, and you allow for tapping into this intelligence. And then this intelligence is like a light shining that shows you what it is that you are in search of. And the thing that we are in search of, Dr. Peace, is the knowledge of who we are. We're in search of it. A lot of us may say, okay, we're in search of love, we're in search of happiness, we want peace and security, but all of those things are byproducts of self-knowledge. When you really know who you are, then that's when the oneness of love exists. That's when peace exists. That's when happiness abounds. not knowing who you are, then you become misidentified with a wrong entity complex. And that's the basis of all your suffering, the basis of all your problems, because you're relating out of that complex and not even really knowing that you are relating out of that complex. And that's what's creating all of the problems. Once you begin to see that I am the problem that is being projected out in the world that I see, and have that insight, that kills this misidentification that you have created. It's not just individually created, it's a societal created mental construct. Once you have an insight into that, then now this intelligence brings forth this permanent identity that you have always been and will always be, and all of your problems are solved.
Well, now we need to get to the crux of the problems that we need to solve, because we've got centuries-old problems to solve, stemming from having been disrupted, stemming from having had our growth and development suppressed, stemming from having been alienated from ourselves and our culture and everything else that was familiar to us, not being allowed to carry the practices that the rituals and the practices that were familiar to us and a part of us forward, because they were banned. The use of the drum was banned. I'm understanding that when a captive on the plantation would get the spirit, he would have to put a pot over his head or something in order to shout into it to keep from being heard. That they were not allowed to assemble, you know, on their own. They could not take the initiative to assemble. They were allowed to assemble when the slave owner said to assemble under the watchful eyes of the overseer. And then they were fed all of this misrepresentation of misrepresentation, as you clearly pointed out. Those who had been exposed to any of the teachings of the ancient Egyptians had not learned them well enough, and the evidence I use always is Socrates, who was accused of being, you know, preaching, you know, foreign knowledge, and having to drink hemlock, having have executed himself because he was corrupting the young men in the society. So it was clear that he either lacked understanding, or he lacked the means by which he could convince the other people who executed him that this was not dangerous knowledge, this was beneficial knowledge. So the thing is that you have some people who were slow learners at best, or maybe mentally retarded at worst, who were attempting to miseducate even what they knew. They corrupted what they thought they knew. So you have this is a can of worms unlike any that you could ever imagine. So here you have somebody who is teaching somebody to teach you, somebody who is ignorant, and who is teaching somebody to miseducate you. And then because you are in association with others on the plantation, then this is getting exchanged and it's getting passed on, and the children are viewing this and they're observing that this is apparently what you mean to do, rather than this is being imposed, because children don't know. They don't know that this is being inflicted on their parents. They think this is what their parents choose to do. And so after a while it becomes something of a custom, and after a while it isn't investigated. And that's why it's important at this point for us to realize that miseducation continues. It is not a past tense. It continues, and it is time for us to investigate those things which we have simply taken for granted, and we have learned, especially those things that are to our detriment, because obviously it's to our detriment to be divided among ourselves, to have men divided away from women, to have old people divided against away from the young. When I think about senior citizens housing, I think what an awful experiment that is, to have seniors outside of the community.
Right.
You know, it's almost like putting them in exile. So we've got a lot of things to cure, and it goes a long way, and it requires study and insight and a willingness to admit that a lot of what we know is erroneous.
Right. It's false. And it starts with us. It starts with us because Dr. Wade Nobles, I like how he explains how the experiences of one generation become the history of the next generation, and then the history of several generations become the traditions of a people. And that what has happened to us is that we have started a tradition that started back in slavery times of us being non-African because of our miseducation. And that's become our negative tradition. But since the experiences of one generation become the history of the next, and several generations become traditions of a people, we can change all of that by changing what we do in this generation, and then pass that experience on to the next generation.
And it'll become their history, and therefore the tradition.
Exactly. And as you continue to do that, then it'll become a tradition. So it's not something that's going to be an event that'll happen, of course, as we know, overnight or within the next couple of years or so. This is something that we have to do. Each of us take the responsibility to re-educate ourselves, and then pass on the experiences of what we have learned to our children, because that is our responsibility to make sure our children receive an education that's going to advance their image and interests, because this is not what is happening in the educational facilities that they are into right now. Again, there is really no such thing as standard education. In the same way, there's no such thing as American culture. America is a country where there are many different ethnic groups expressing themselves out of the culture that they that is their background, and there's no standard body of education. There's not even really a standard model of health. There's no standard model of health that you can everyone receive the same way of being treated medicine-wise. A lot of us, because the European model is being used in the health system, we are not being we're not receiving proper health. And Dr. Healthcare, Dr. Jewel Pookrum talks about this a lot. And then she started Neutralite, and she talks about the melanin within us, and how because we are people who possess a great amount of melanin, that's a different requirement for us in terms of our medical needs, and that have to be taken into consideration. And so it's our responsibility to make sure that our children receive the proper education that helps to advance them. And we can only assume that responsibility when we re-educate ourselves. And there have been numerous scholars that have done many-year study and research to recover the African wisdom that has been intentionally buried to keep us forever ignorant of who we are, because when you are cut off from the ties of knowing who you are through your history, your tradition, and culture, then that keeps you subordinate. You can't grow. A people without a knowledge of history is like a tree without roots, and it cannot grow, you cannot move forward. But scholars like Dr. Sheikh Anta Diop, Dr. Chancellor Williams, Dr. John Henry
Do not forget
Clark,
the late, great Asa Hilliard.
Of course. Dr. Asa Hilliard, Seba, The Reawakening of the African Mind. That's an excellent book that he wrote, among the other many books that he has written. And there are many other African scholars who have pioneered hard to uncover the truths that has been buried. And we can re-educate ourselves and receive the African paradigm that had been replaced by a European paradigm, which is not helping us as a people to really move forward and come up out of this rut that we really are in. Because when you look at, after all of these years, we are still the most economic, political, spiritually impoverished people of all of the ethnic groups. And this is because we are the only ones who have suffered generational impoverishment and a robbing of our knowledge of culture. You can find a Greek town, an Italian town, a Chinatown. You won't find an African town. Why is that? When other ethnic groups speak their language around us, some of us may feel like, well, why are they talking that? Why can't they just talk English? It's natural for them to speak their mother tongue. Our mother tongue was taken from us. And so we don't have that to talk from. And as you know, language is very important, because the language that you speak.
Language is the key.
It is.
Language is the key. Language is a culture bearer. That is what carries your culture.
Exactly.
It's a vehicle of culture. And without it, hydroponic again. You don't have nowhere to anchor yourself and to develop yourself, to develop these roots that you need in order to develop yourself as a full-blown tree or full-blown forest. So language is the key.
It is.
It is absolutely the key, and that's actually the subject of another program, because we really need to take that on. But you know, we have people who, it's sort of like, you know, when an alcoholic is drinking, you cannot say anything to an alcoholic to convince him that what he is doing is against his best interest, because the alcohol has made him a fool. So miseducation has made us fools, and it is hard to convince miseducated people that they have been miseducated, especially if they are being rewarded for their, quote, education, as in collecting up various and sundry pieces of paper that says you have a degree in this, and you have a degree in that, and you know, and you got a resume or a vita that says that, you know, you have attained all of this, and so this tells you that you're doing okay. But when you point out that we are impoverished in all these ways, we're impoverished even though we work the hardest. You know, we're impoverished spiritually even though we are the main church goers and the main supporters of even mega churches. So it's a contradiction that we should work the hardest and be the poorest, that we should contribute the most to churches and be the most spiritually bereft among people. There's something wrong with that picture, and we ought to want to know, why is it that we have so many religious organizations, and yet our lot as a people continues to decline? We continue to have the infestation of drugs and gangs and all kinds of antisocial elements in our community. We lose more and more control over our young, where they are going in one direction and we're going in another, and unable to get them to follow us. If that doesn't tell us that something is wrong, that we are unable to make the major decisions that determine our fate, then we ought to know that there's got to be something that's going on that can be identified, that we can see.
And that's why, as I was saying earlier, it all begins with observation. Because so many of us, sure, we're blinded by these beliefs, that we're not really observing the real predicament that we have as a people. We're not looking at the conditions that we live on. We're not looking at our economic ability, our political power, our spiritual knowledge. We're not looking at it, actually observing it. We're operating on the basis of beliefs that everything is going to be taken care of for us. All we got to do is pray a little bit more and God will take care of us. And this is the way that we have been instructed to have a religious orientation, which is not the African way. And it starts with observing, because if you begin to observe and look at how we are living as a people, then you'll see this is not working for us. We're working the hardest, but yet what are we getting compensating wise? What's happening to us? We're not making any changes economically. We're basically consumers. We're not producing anything.
We are consumers, not just basically. We are consumers. We are not producers.
Right. We're not producing. And when it comes to politics, are we engaging in politics that involves decision making that's toward the advancement and promotion of our people?
No, politics, we engage in politics which promotes individuals. It's like beauty contests. We elect the person who looks the best to us, that we like the best. We don't ask the hard questions about who is in this person's camp, who is supporting this person, what is this person's record as relates to the schools in our communities, the health care in our communities, all the various things that you just pointed out that are things that we need to have addressed. What are the positions of these various candidates, and where did we get these candidates? Did we send these candidates out from us and say, go out and we will support you, and then when you are in position, you will be able to do something to alleviate some of our suffering? No, suddenly we have some person who is selected for us, well, maybe not even selected for us, somebody who is selected, who we presume is from us. But, you know, again, miseducated people cannot know the difference between right and wrong, and they cannot really know the difference between that which is in their interest and that which is not in their interest. They keep getting knocked down every time. They get back up again. They go get knocked down again, because they just cannot believe that if they follow the, quote, American way, and they go to school and they get a good education, they get a good job, that they won't be able to live the good life. They just cannot believe that this is not true for everyone.
It's a sad reality that exists for us. And the miseducation process of being taken out of a knowledge of who you are is so devastating. It's so devastating. And it's interesting enough, in spite of that, we are survivors, and we are finding ways to survive.
Well, you have to give the grace of God a whole lot of credit here, because we are not finding these things of our own volition. Were it not for the grace of God, the kinds of decisions that we are making would have destroyed us as a people. But apparently, there is enough grace for us to make some errors that will not obliterate us from the face of the earth. But we cannot continue to make the kinds of decisions that we make and expect this grace to abound forever, because we can do better than we do.
That's why,
even in our miseducated state.
That's why each of us has to see our responsibility that we have to correct this miseducation process. And then spread that out. Each one reach one, and the one that you reach first, of course, is yourself, and then each one teach one. So as you learn, then you share and teach. And the first ones that you should teach would be your children. So you share that. And this is something that is ongoing. I think that we're in the process of mental liberation. It's not as large as it need to be to produce a big effect on our people as a whole. But there are a lot of people who have re-educated themselves, and there are a lot of people who are in the process of re-educating themselves. And there are certain African-centered schools that exist that involve the African mind in learning about the world from an Afrocentric point of view, which is very important.
But there are not nearly enough of them.
No, they're not
So
enough.
we need to have a whole lot more of this going on in homes.
That's right.
You know?
It
And people
starts at
need to
home.
presume that they have enough innate intelligence to be able to take on this challenge. You know, that they don't have to really go somewhere and get a degree, that if these are your children and you have given birth to them, that you have something that you can teach them.
Right, but the whole thing with the degree is, again, ties into the fact that if we don't, not that I'm advocating this, but the fact that if we don't already have employment structures set up so that our children can find employment, then where will they work?
Well, we don't have to go as far down as the next generation. Where will we work if this economy continues in the direction that it's going in? So, you know, we may not get to the point at which we have to wonder about where our children work. We need to be concerned about how do we become self-sustaining at this point in time. What's your take on that?
Well, my take on it is, first of all, your life has a purpose. And this is not the first time that we have lived.
All right.
So life does not end. You're living in, but your life does not end. There are after-death experiences. So you must find out what is your purpose in life and solve that. If you don't know it, if you've been miseducated to believe that your purpose is to be wealthy instead of being more knowledgeable of who you are, because it's more in the African way to have more being than to have more things, to be more
Than to
have more. So your purpose is to know who you are, and you have to start from there, starting really from the position of you not knowing who you are, and then ask that question, well, who am I? Why am I here? Now, of course, we've been told a lot of different things, but what you do is you subject your knowledge base to an inspection, because you're more than what you know. And in that process of inspecting your knowledge, how did you get this knowledge? Who gave you this knowledge? Who were your teachers? Is it working for you in your life? Are you solving your problems? As you begin to ask questions, you're opening up yourself, becoming receptive, and you will tap into this intelligence that will give you all the answers that you're in search of, and that will make a way for you to create. First of all, it will make a way for you to fulfill your life's purpose, and it will make a way for you to help create conditions that will help others to fulfill their life purpose too. That intelligence, when it comes out, it acts. It's not like there's something that you have to do next after you have contacted it. It acts itself. So it's not anything as a way of creating an agenda that you're going to move toward. The agenda is created as you make contact with that intelligence. It creates the agenda, and then you act out of that. And that's the first step. And the reason why I said that it's important to understand that this is not the first time that you have lived, that life does not have an ending, because if you believe that you only live once, then you're going to connect everything you do to this one life, which is going to be materialistic in some sense, getting all the gusto that you can get, trying to own everything that you can own. And see, this is the ancient Egyptian and African way of understanding life, understanding what real education is, what real spirituality is, because this was all that they were involved with. And we need to have a movement toward resurrecting that wisdom and knowledge also, because as you said, we've been set off course from understanding things rightly, from not only just knowing who we are, but the purpose of our life. Why are we here? And all of these things were answered during ancient times. And people who conquered the ancient Egyptians, not understanding their spiritual way of life, now they have created a way of living that is not accurate, that is not fulfilling. But that doesn't mean that as we live now, that we can't still fulfill the purpose of life. Because if life never ends, then life really never had a beginning.
Right.
And so what that means is who you really are has always existed, will always exist. And that in you understanding this, really understanding it, not just intellectually, but being illuminated into a knowledge of knowing thyself, real knowledge. When you really know that, that acts and that communicates. And everyone who comes in contact with this knowledge, they will be helped. You will know how to help them.
How have you come into this? How have you come into this way of thinking?
Well, it's interesting, Dr. Peace, because it's a little difficult for me to explain. Because when I was 13 years old, I was reading books by U.S. Anderson, The Three Magic Words and The Secret, The Magic in Your Mind, The Secret of Secrets, and everything that he was talking about was about God realization, enlightenment, the purpose of human life, and the purpose of your human birth, why you are a human being, because human beings have the ability to be God conscious, to know thyself, Homo sapiens sapien, man who knows that he knows. I was interested in all of these things at the age of 13, so it's how do you explain a 13-year-old reading and having
being led to that kind of literature.
Right, of why was I attracted to an understanding of not trying to come into some relationship with a God that exists outside of me, or hoping that my living will afford me through my good actions some way of entering into a heaven that's outside of me. At that age, I was understanding that God was within me and that God also exists outside of me, but to come into a knowledge of who God is, it was an inward journey. And so that U.S. Anderson kind of started me, and from there I went into Krishnamurti and Ramana Maharshi and the Sagadatta, and I got involved with spiritual organizations and just moving on. So but it started when I was 13 years old, and I don't know how to explain, not that I'm unique.
You were guided, you think?
Was I guided? I think I was from within, though, because the home that I came from, my father was a minister, Reverend Harvey Gentry, and my family went to church and attended church regularly, but I was on a church attendee. I did not believe that there was a need for a mediator between God and me, which the church is advocating, that you must have a mediator and accept a Savior that is going to give to you
a middleman.
Right. And so I would go to church on Family and Friends Days, and I would participate in the things that were going on. But as far as really becoming a member, I never became a member. So I don't know how you can explain. I guess it was something that from a prior life in a form of karma, being that there's so many people were born with things that they did not just learn in this life, that came from prior lives. And provided that you don't know who you are fully as a human being and access the God within you, then when you're living in this term, you will take on another life. There is such a thing as reincarnation. And you will continue your journey from where you left off. So I do believe, I guess I can say as some form of explanation, that I believe that in my prior life that I had learned some things that placed my interests where they were as a child in certain things, and I kind of picked up from perhaps where I left off. And
where do you see yourself going?
Where I see myself going?
Yes.
Well, there's really nowhere to go.
Okay.
The destination is non-local.
Okay.
It's everywhere and nowhere.
Okay.
But in terms of realizing that, that is what we all must do before our living in the body ends. That's the purpose of your human birth, to realize who you are to the fullest. So going in the sense of there's nowhere to go.
Okay.
I'm a mystic, Dr. Peace, so that's the cornerstone of my knowledge I speak from.
Well, you don't have to stop there. We have 1 minute.
All right. So the spirituality is different from religion in that spirituality is your natural birthright. You don't have to be converted to it. In fact, you already are it. You just have to become aware of it. So it's more about attuning to natural laws in the universe and the natural self that you are, as opposed to conforming to the norms or beliefs of what a religion consists of. So all of us are spiritual by nature, and we have this human birth to realize who we are as spiritual beings. And religion can get in the way of that, because what religions do is they place a middleman in between God and you, and there's really no middleman.
Thank you, Wayne Sebamurti Gentry. I know that we can't get this book, The Nature of Intelligence, a look beyond mere thinking, at the time, but at some day soon, do you think you might reprint?
Yes.
All right.
Yes.
Good to hear that.
Okay, thank you for having me again.
So now you got to do it.
Oh, yes.
Let's see what's up.